Wait, do you see the next slide?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
cool. I just wanted to make sure I shared the right one. Okay, cool. So also, if at any point anyone from social movements wants to add, please feel free to do so. Um, okay, oops. Okay, so to begin, we first started our semester kind of what social movements are. So social movements are a distinct way of doing politics. Um, you know, distinct from, for example, like labor movements, or like religious groups, but are still like parallel with these. And their attributes are the campaign, the repertoire, and Wong displays. And this is the modern social movement. So a campaign means making claims towards an actor that's the object of the claims, which is usually the state. Um, a repertoire consists of like the sort of actions that a movement will take. So, for example, the modern social movement repertoire includes things like petitions, public assemblies, and marches. And then Wunk displays are displays of worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. So, for example, I'm sure a lot of your Instagram feeds looked like the image on the bottom right. A few weeks ago, about a week and a half ago. So this was like a social media campaign that was widely circulated. Um, so the emergence of the modern social movement, which was around the end of the 18th century as like the order of nation states was emerging, is directly related to primitive accumulation, colonization, and the slave trade, which is important to keep in mind in our study of social movements. Um, and then finally, there's like the question of the state, because one of the presuppositions that the modern social movement hinges on is that the claimants are going to be seen as legitimate under the state. Um, and it's kind of a conundrum in this the state is both the object of the claims and complaints, but also the source for a potential solution. So to continue that, we also studied briefly traditional social movements whose repertoire is um, parochial, bifurcated, and particular, meaning that it's more specific to a certain scenario, and that the tactics bifurcated are much more confrontational. So this can look like, you know, targeting like an individual, like landlord or politician, or like setting up a barricade to prevent a tax collector from like coming to your town. Um, Versus the modern repertoire, which is cosmopolitan, and autonomous, which means it can pretty much be like widely like reproduced in a bunch of different scenarios, um, and that it also consists of like a lot of people who are in relation with each other, um, not necessarily out of being like geographically connected as it would be like in, you know, before the 18th century, um, but more like socially connected. So again, this repertoire can look like petitions, marches, social like political campaigns. Look at my notes. So we also studied the history of like the development of social movement theory. And in its early stages, it was mostly focused on collective behavior and crowds as a social actor. Um, and the characteristics of this theory is that like social strange, for example, can give rise to a movement. So for example, a precipitating factor like somebody getting murdered by the police can give rise to like an eruption in social activity. um, Resource mobilization theory is focused on like the material and social organizational aspects of social movements. So it's more about how a movement will mobilize their resources in order to achieve their goals. And then political process theory focuses on the political opportunities that can give rise to a social movement. So, for example, um, during the pandemic, when there was like an increase in social discontent due to like a failure to respond to the pandemic and an economic depression, this also gave rise to a political opportunity to enact like greater impact in the form of riots or protests to answer like a political situation. And then finally, new social movement theory kind of takes in factors from all of these and also focuses on the cultural and social aspects of social movements. So it looks at things like collective identity and how people come together to share grievances and participate in action. So I'm going to be focusing from two main readings. So Cloud and Piven, Poor People's Movements, had to do with working through the issue of a social movement versus a social movement organization. And Cloud and Piven gave the argument that social organizations, for example, like Women's March or Black Lives Matter, actually end up deterring a social movement. And they made the distinction that a social movement consists of both a change in consciousness and a change in behavior on a mass scale. Um, so they argue that organizations become an end to themselves and end up pulling people out of struggle and out of the streets in order to maintain themselves. Um, and okay, and then for negative sanctions, Cloud and Piven say that a protest is most effective when negative sanctions can be imposed. So, meaning that, if the protesters have a lot of institutional power, as in like holding a position of like power or being influential in an institution, that makes the protest more effective. But when people don't have a lot of institutional power, the sort of negative sanctions they can impose change. So they give like a riot as an example of imposing a negative sanction on disrupting social order. Um, and then finally, they address the way that elites will respond to protests by repressing, co-opting, or granting concessions. So we've seen, examples of all three of these throughout the summer. There's been a lot of violent repression, but also, the way in which it's framed is really manipulated so that the blame is put on the protesters or the co-opting or granting of concessions. Um, speaks to speaks to the tendency of politicians and elite to make small or symbolic concessions to a movement in order to appease it. But the problem with these concessions is that they can then be taken away at any point. And okay, so Paulette and Kishmer and movement factions was another great reading that we did. And they talked about how social movements basically operate within structural limitations that then lead to them having to make decisions about what sort of tactics and repertoires they're going to operate under, which becomes a strategic dilemma and can lead to factions arising in a movement. So, for example, during like the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, there were decisions that had to be made on whether there was going to be a focus on voter registration or on like more militant tactics and anti-systemic tactics. Players in arenas is a useful tool. It's just kind of looking at um, who is operating within social movements and where they're occurring. Um, so for example, with like the current situation, like players can be, you know, the police, it can be protesters that are out on the streets, it can be the media and how it's like operating in relation to and within the movement. And the arenas can be both, you know, the physical cities where this is happening, but also we can take like a wider lens and look at global struggles, or we can look at, you know, the discourse happening on social media and in like academic spaces. Um, then finally, collective identity is a really important factor in like the emergence of these factions, because, you know, it's both rational as far as, you know, being like unified in your tactics, but it's also emotional as far as like who you identify with and like who you want to be in unity with. Um, and it's an important basis to build off of in struggle. And then the latter part of our semester was focused on Black liberation struggles. So our case studies included the Haitian Revolution, the American Civil War, and then, you know, in the use of violence in social movements, the Seattle Black Bloc. And this is a quote from the Black Jacobins. So it goes, "The cruelties of property and privilege are always more ferocious than the revenges of property and oppression. All timid as well as bold soon understood that there was no hope except for the revolution, and they flocked to join in its ranks." Um, so I picked out these two concepts, initial moment of violence and collective identity, in relation to this class. Um, Something that we circled around a lot in our discussion was this tension between the state being the only actor that has, you know, legitimate use of force, and the effectiveness of use of violence as far as legitimizing people who were not otherwise going to be recognized under the state as legitimate claim makers, such as enslaved people. The tactics that you had to take became were different than the ones that you'd be able to take if you were recognized under the law as a legitimate claim maker. Um, so um, yeah, we studied the really violent riots that broke out at the beginning of the Haitian Revolution that then became an important basis for the struggle as a whole, but also for the formation of a collective identity of enslaved people that then became revolutionaries. And then in the case of the American Civil War, um, it was, you know, this mass deserting of plantations as well as like the killing of plantation owners in order to thrust themselves as enslaved people to the forefront of the Civil War and actually make the Civil War like about liberation. Yeah, so that's all I've got. I didn't come up with any discussion
Can I add on a
questions.
point actually to
Yeah,
like exactly that point?
yeah.
It just made me think of when you all were talking about your class last week, this idea of like the connection between violence and the formation of a collective identity. And I think you all talked about like some aspect of like the necessity for violence in a social movement. And I mean, your whole class was about violence, but like how oftentimes like you're not seen as legitimate until you like make a clear point, and making that clear point, oftentimes you have to use violence. So it's not really a fully formed thought yet, but like connecting that to this idea of collective identity, I think is very interesting, because like not only do you have to have this collective identity to like survive as a movement, you have to have it like for yourself individually to keep going. So I think it's like I like that connection.
Yeah, that's really great. Actually, I believe like you guys read Franz Fanon in your seminar, and he talks a lot about like formational violence and, violence is being key in the formation of a new man when it comes to colonized people, like fighting for liberation. So I think that's a great point. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Also, I have to go in 5 minutes, sadly, because I have another meeting at noon. Well, it's noon here, but yeah. I'll be leaving in like 5 minutes. I don't want to interrupt at that time, though.
I think the discussion of like how collective identities plays out in social movements and conceptions of violence, it can like take so many forms in a conversation, like how people view themselves within the collective identity, how the collective identity affects the action that they choose to take, how collective identity is formed on the basis of like morals in terms of are you willing or not to commit some act of violence in for the sake of your movement. I think there's just so many directions to go with like the idea of identity and like what sort of identities tend to make up a movement. In what ways do people's individual identities play into the collective identities? I think there's a lot of conversation there, and I'm really glad you guys brought it up. Also, like, thank you for the review of your semester. It was nice to just sort of be able to refresh my memory on what we had done in that class.
Yeah, yeah, I think the issue of like movement factions like becoming a basis for collective identity, um, I think has really been like a big discussion point like around like the uprisings because there's like a very clear divide between people who are like on principle like for the movement and for what's being fought for but really will draw the line at riots and property destruction and violence. And I think that's like a really it's just really interesting like seeing like these like emerge in a very similar way is like it has played out historically when like violent uprisings do happen in this country.
Yeah, and with that example, I think it's so interesting how in so many like even moderately liberal circles, like there's a calling out of people who have sort of chosen one faction of the debate of saying like, oh, them protesting in this way isn't good, and like a relative like disavowal of that sort of attitude, um, which seems sort of contrary to what we learn in the social movements class. Not necessarily contrary, but this idea of there seeming to be like always two sides, and I guess those two sides certainly do exist, but a lot of the popular narrative is saying like you can't tell black people how to protest and how to respond.
Jacqueline, your time is nearly up. Did you have last thoughts before you had to jump off?
Yeah, I had one other thing. It's not really like, I don't really know how to say it yet. It's just like a thought, but I'll try. So like, thank you so much, Daniela, for doing this for us. I know we like didn't get it together as a group, so thank you for pulling it off for us. But the thing that I was gonna say, like talking about Cloward and Piven and like granting concessions and like all the points, we've seen everything happening that like their theory brought up. We've seen that so far just in like the last few weeks. So I guess I'm like interested to see how factions like come about now, because there are already factions within this movement because this movement isn't new, but like for so many people it is new now. So I guess I'm interested to see like what other factions kind of arise within it. But yeah, that was my thought.
Thinking ahead to your publication, one thing that occurred to me is that if folks are especially interested in Cloud and Piven's contribution and how it overlaps with the kind of real-time dynamics that we're seeing unfolding on the street. One of the things that you might want to do is reach out to Frances directly and see if you can interview her. So if you're interested in doing that, I could put you in touch.
That would be so cool. Okay, I have to go, everyone. Bye.
I noticed at our last meeting, we kind of defaulted to the standard Ithaca College 75-minute block. And I don't know if that was just like a reflex or if people had planned it that way. But if that is what we're gonna do, that means we have about 15 minutes left. And so I'm wondering if we can maybe get like final thoughts in response to Daniela's thing, and then maybe go through some of this logistical stuff, just so that we can be sure that we're all on the same page with respect to next steps.
Sounds great. Yeah, and I think for these two meetings, 75 minutes was a totally sensible marker, even though I don't think like any of us were like, it can only last this long.
Mm-hmm.
Gray and Anna, do you guys have any thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, I actually had a question about the slide with the negative sanctions part, and I'm just wondering if I'm understanding it correctly, because I never took the social movements class.
Yeah.
So was that saying that in order for a protest, like a protest is more successful if there are negative sanctions, or
Yeah.
Okay.
So they were saying like protests are most effective when negative sanctions are imposed. And then, in relation to the social movement versus social organization, it was kind of saying like if the protests have a lot of institutional power, for example, like I don't know, they have like access to like lawmakers, or if they have a lot of influence, versus when they don't, like what are the negative sanctions that they can impose. And it's usually, it can look like property destruction, or like not, or like not showing up for work, or like disrupting social order. Did that clarify?
Yeah,
okay,
for sure. And yeah, now I understand more how that connects with what we talked about in our presentation,
right,
with like George Jackson, like Fanon, and
exactly,
that.
yeah.
So thank you.
I think a big indicator of that in like the current movement is the slogan of like no justice, no peace, like withdrawing civility as a negative sanction on the state for not addressing the issues that are at hand.
And that's a slogan that dates back to the '92 LA riots. So it's also reflective of a kind of like historical memory of a particular mode of struggle.
Yeah, dang.
Great. Did you want to jump in with thoughts on the presentation, or on like how it connects to the case?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that it was a great like reminder for everything that we learned in the class. I am shocked by how much I actually remembered, which is nice. But yeah, I think it's great. Yeah.
Thank you for making the presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Guys. Sorry if it wasn't like entirely clear. And
No, it was awesome.
Thank you, Daniela. So I came up with a few sort of next step tasks that we need to figure out collectively how to deal with. It might make sense to kill the recording at this point. Like, I don't know if it'll be super relevant to the folks who want to check this out.